Grace Lee didn't hear the library door open. She only felt the temperature shift, how old rooms hold their breath when a new presence enters. Standing on the fifth rung of a wooden A-frame ladder, she coaxed dust from the filigree of a 19th-century cornice with a sable brush and a square of cheesecloth. Walnut and tobacco swirled in the air. A clock the size of a shield ticked with the authority of a judge. Somewhere below, marble floors reflected a winter sky cut into glass panes. She saw him in the beveled reflection, not head-on, shoulders squared beneath a black suit that didn't shine, because real money never needed to be loud. Antonio Bianchi moved like decisions, precise, unhurried, inevitable. The city called him a dozen names, most behind hands. In the restoration world, where Grace spoke softly to dead wood and the ghosts inside it, she only knew the file she'd signed. No eye contact, no questions, no personal items left behind. A breath warmed the fine hairs above her collar. "You shouldn't look at me like that." The voice pressed along the curve of her ear, low, rough, threaded with restraint. She startled, foot slipping. The ladder hiccuped. The sable brush fell, a dark petal spinning toward the rug. A hand, fast, hot, closed around her ankle. Grace froze. Her body learned the memory first. The way a fall could rewire a life. The way strangers' hands could feel like mercy or like possession. She found the wall with the heel of her palm, found the rung again, swallowed the wild rush in her ribs. "Hold on," he said. "I am." She hated how breathless she sounded. "Let go." He did, instantly, as if her command had weight. She climbed down, each step loud enough to count, and turned. Up close, Antonio's face was a study in restraint. High cheekbones, dark eyes like burnished espresso, a mouth that didn't default to kindness, but could be devastating when it chose. He wasn't wearing a tie. The open collar made him less safe. "I wasn't looking at you," she lied. "You were." His gaze flicked to the cornice. "Through the glass, it still counts." She crouched to retrieve her brush, praying her hands would stop shaking. "I look at everything. That's the job." "Then you know how things break," he said, "and how they're repaired. Some things shouldn't be." He said it like an axiom. She dusted the fallen bristles against her cloth. "Wood remembers the hand that shaped it. That's why it yields to the same touch." "Does it?" He looked at her fingers, clean and steady now. "Is that how you get it to obey?" "I don't make it obey." She stood. "I listen." Something minuscule shifted in his face, the way a locked door might consider easing at the hinge. He took one step closer, not enough to trap, enough to test. She didn't move. She refused to be furniture in a room he owned. "Name?" he asked, though she knew he knew. "Grace Lee." "Grace?" he repeated, like he was testing the geometry of it. "Who sent you up that ladder?" "Your estate manager." She lifted her chin toward the cornice. The varnish had bloomed. "You'll get ghosting in winter light if you don't lift and reseal." "You tell everyone their house is haunted by bad restoration?" "Only the people who can fix it." He almost smiled. Almost. "You're not like the others they send. I'm not a maid, I'm a conservator. And yet you came on a cleaner's contract." "I came on a contract that pays by the hour." He nodded once, as if he respected the answer. "When were you going to ask me what I'm doing in my own library during business hours?" "I already know," she said. "You live here." A flicker in his eyes, amusement, then something cooler. "And what do you think I'm doing now?" "Testing me." She matched his look. "To see if you can make me flinch." "Did I?" "Not in ways that matter." He stepped aside, giving her a corridor of space. The courtesy was not an apology. "Finish your work," he said. "If you need a second ladder, ask for Marco." "I don't need Marco." "You will, if you fall." "Then I'll fall better." That made him look at her again, long enough for the clock to mark 2 heartbeats, 3. "Don't," he said softly. "We bruise easy here." She climbed back up. The lintel smelled like orange oil and old heat. Below, his phone buzzed. He spoke in Italian, a dialect not taught in the online classes she'd taken at 2 a.m. but one she could follow if the verbs stayed familiar. Niente mosse fino a notte. No nessun rischio per gli esterni. No moves until night. No risk to outsiders. He glanced up once. She kept her eyes on the wood. Her ears didn't listen. Her bones did. When she finished resealing the lifted patch, she descended to sign the work order. The library door opened before she could ask permission. A man with a broken nose profile and a suit that fit like a holster stepped in. "Boss," he said to Antonio, not to her. "We have visitors." Antonio didn't look surprised. "Expect it?" "No. The green jag. 2 in front, 1 walking the wall. They're pretending to be lost." Antonio's attention cut to Grace so sharply she felt it on her skin. "You're done here. I have to clean the brushes. You can clean them downstairs." She met his eyes and saw calculation there, not cruelty, triage. "Is it safe to walk through your foyer right now?" she asked. A beat. "No." "Then I'll use the utility sink in the back hall and wait in the service pantry until your visitors are gone." Marco, she assumed this was Marco, twitched a glance at Antonio. Something like question. Like her. Antonio gave the barest shake of his head, then flicked 2 fingers. Marco vanished like a command obeyed itself. Antonio turned back to her. "You don't scare easy." "I do." She slid the brush into its case. "I just don't shake where people can use it." "Who taught you that?" "My mother," she said. "She taught me how to break without making a sound." His gaze lingered, softened, hardened again. "Stay away from the glass. If you hear anything that doesn't sound like a door, sit on the floor." "Because bullets travel," she said, too calm. "Because I won't always be quick enough to catch your ankle." Something in her face must have given her away. The memory of pressure, the heat in his hand, because his expression shifted from command to something else, something that felt perilously close to care. "Go," he said. She went. The back hall smelled like lemons and steel. Pipes pinged. She washed the brush, wrists steady, breath even, the way she'd learned to breathe when the surgeon called with a new number and said insurance didn't speak her language. She dried the sable on rice paper and set it in its slot. The service pantry was small and square, a rescued space lined with shelves of silver frames and table linens heavy as curtains. She sat on the floor with her back to the cabinets and let the city gallop in her ears. Muffled voices, doors breathing open, closing flat, a scrape of shoe on marble, then the sudden quiet of men deciding. Grace had learned to read silences. She knew the one that came before a storm and the one that followed a bad decision. This one tasted like neither. It tasted like a line drawn on cold stone. Her phone vibrated. A text from the agency, confirming additional hours approved for Bianchi property. "You're cleared for evening work this week." Below it, a second text, unsourced, no contact name. "You're late. Traffic on the Whitestone again, Grace?" Her chest went tight. She hadn't told anyone her route. She hadn't told anyone she'd taken the B line to the transfer, or that she'd walked past the deli with the broken neon fish to avoid the men on the stoop. She locked the screen and slid the phone under her thigh like she could pin the threat beneath her. The pantry door clicked. She didn't move. The door opened a fraction, then wider. Not Marco, Antonio. He filled a room the way a storm fills a sky, quiet, total. "You're leaving," he said. "Am I fired?" "You're leaving," he repeated, like fired was too small a word. 2 minutes. Bring only what you can carry without slowing your feet. "I can't take the subway with this kit." "You're not taking the subway," he said. "You're not taking anything but the stairs." She stood. What happened? They asked questions they shouldn't know to ask. He held out a hand, palm up. She didn't give him hers. He didn't insist. "Someone texted you," he added, eyes on her pocket. "Wrong number," she said. He said nothing. The silence judged her for her lie and past sentence. Protection anyway. The service stairwell was a narrow rib of concrete. Lights hummed like bees. On the second landing he stopped and pressed the wall. What looked like a seam became a door. What looked like a pantry became a narrow corridor that smelled like air nobody paid to heat. He stepped through and waited until she did too, then pulled the panel closed. The hallway beyond was lined with steel drawers and boxes labeled in tight, exact handwriting. He moved to one of the drawers as if to prove something and slid it open. Inside lay folders, razor thin. Black elastic bands kept their mouths shut. The tab on the topmost one read a name squared by a stapled photo. Lee Grace. She stared at the printout like it could stop existing if she refused to read it. "I didn't make this," Antonio said softly. "I found it." Her voice felt made of paper. "Where?" "On my doorstep," he said, 3 days before you arrived." Her mouth went dry. "So you hired me anyway." "I hired a conservator who could handle fragile things." His eyes didn't move from hers. "And I watched to see who would watch you watching me." "Who's watching me?" "The same people watching me," he said. "And they want us to believe you belong to them." She forced herself to look down at the folder. The photo wasn't from today. It was from last year, crossing a street outside the clinic with a white envelope in her hand and February in her bones. The timestamp was accurate down to the second. Behind that folder, other tabs waited, gray, tidy, inevitable. She didn't have to read them to know the shape of her life in black ink. Mother, Yunmi Lee, oncology, Queens, employer, Janus Heritage Services, subcontractor, debt, itemized, route, Whitestone, transfer at 59th. All the ways to break a girl who only had 2 hands to hold the roof up. "Who sent it?" she asked. "Men who don't sign things. The car outside belongs to one of them." "And if I leave with you now," she said, "what does that make me?" "Alive," he said. Then he added, as if he owed her the line he should have started with, "Safe." Her heart did something reckless. "I don't let men decide my life." "Then decide," he said, and he meant it. And she felt the difference between orders and choices like a clean breath. She decided. "Fine," she whispered. "But if my mother gets so much as a phone call she doesn't understand." "She won't," he said. "Not from them, not about you." "And not from you," she shot back. "Not without my consent." The corner of his mouth changed. Approval, respect, a hint of relief. "Not without your consent." He held out his hand again. Not to take, to offer. She didn't give him hers, but she walked beside him. The corridor spit them into a garage lit like midnight in a museum. A sedan idled, the color of water under bridges. Marco held the rear door. Behind his shoulder, 2 men in dark coats scanned the alley like they expected the air to throw knives. "Phone," Antonio said. "I'm not giving you my phone." "Then turn it off." She did. He handed her a slim pouch like a gift. "Drop it in here. Signal kills." She slid the dead phone into the pouch. It felt like throwing a coin into a well you didn't believe in but wished on anyway. They drove in silence, past stone that had seen too much rain. The city unrolled like a hard truth. Grace watched it, feeling the familiar ache in her jaw she got when she refused to cry. Antonio watched the rearview mirror with the kind of stillness men cultivate around detonators. "Who flagged me?" she asked finally. "People who hate me," he said. "And people who need me. That doesn't narrow it." "It doesn't." She turned to him. "Why tell me any of this?" "Because another bullet will come," he said, like he was naming the weather. "Because the next question they ask at my door will have your mother's name on it. Because if you stay, you have to know what the room costs. If you leave, you have to know why." She tasted the iron in his honesty and couldn't decide if it comforted or terrified. "And what do you want me to do?" "Finish the cornice," he said. "Then decide if you want to touch anything else in my house." The sedan slid into an underground bay. Concrete swallowed the sound. Marco opened her door and didn't offer a hand. Another respect, maybe. The elevator hummed them up into silence, into a smaller library lined with books that looked handled, not staged. A piano slept beneath a cloth. A framed photograph faced the keys, 2 boys on a summer stoop, one already dressed like a future. Antonio lifted the cloth and let it fall. He touched the lid, not the keys. "Where am I?" Grace asked. "A place nobody knows I have until they earn it." "Why am I here?" "So you can breathe," he said. "And so I can ask you a question without someone else putting a dot over the I." He turned to her, and for the first time there was nothing between them but a room and the question. "Who taught you to look at me like that?" he asked. She could have said, "You did." "When you caught my ankle?" "When you didn't make me give you my hand." She could have said, "The city did," when it taught me how to find the hinge that opens a locked thing. Instead, she said, "No one. It's how I look at dangerous objects that someone loved once." He didn't move for a long time. Then, quiet as dust, "Don't look at me like something you can fix. I don't fix people." She met his eyes. "I fix what people ruin." They held there, a rope stretched between their throats. The elevator pinged like a dropped pin on a map. Marco's voice, thin through the speaker. "Boss, we have a problem." Antonio pressed the button. "Go." "Incoming package left at the estate gate. No courier, no prints." "And?" "It's a file," Marco said. "Marked for you. Inside. Photos of the girl's route to the clinic, Tuesday mornings, Thursdays after 5. Someone circled the side entrance. Red ink." Grace's stomach turned to glass. Antonio looked at her, not away. "This is where men like me say, 'You're under my protection now.'" "And what do men like me say?" she asked. He stepped closer, past propriety, into truth. "You say yes or no." Her pulse counted it out. She wanted to be made of iron and found she was made of breath. "Yes," she said, and it was not surrender. It was strategy. In the speaker, Marco exhaled. "Boss, there's more." "What?" "The file has her name misspelled in one place, not a random typo. It's the way an old intake form spelled it, years ago. The only copy of that form isn't digital." "Then how do they have it?" "That's the problem," Marco said. "Either the clinic has a leak, or someone with access to the original drawers took a picture." Antonio finished. Grace felt the room tilt like ladders sometimes do. Her mother's name hung open in a stranger's mouth. The library clock downstairs ticked in her skull. Antonio reached, not to touch her, but to steady the space between them. "Look at me," he said. She did. She hated that she needed the order to do it. "We'll handle it," he said. "We," she echoed. "On your terms," he added, and she believed him because men who lie don't put the knife where you can see it. "Start with one answer," she said, and she let her voice be the sharp thing. "Who put my file at your door?" The elevator doors sighed. The city breathed. Somewhere between the floor and the truth, a hinge decided whether it would open. And before Antonio could answer, the lights flickered, once, twice, and a line of text slid across the secure monitor on the wall like a signature cutting through quiet. "We're not here for him, Grace. We're here for you." The room held its breath. Would the hinge give? Or break? The words on the monitor burned white in a room that suddenly felt too small for air. "We're not here for him, Grace. We're here for you." Marco's oath came thin through the speaker, then the sound of bodies moving. A muffled cascade of instructions. Sweep, lock, confirm. Antonio didn't look away from the message until it blinked out, replaced by a camera grid of black and white rectangles. The mansion gate, a stone path veined with winter light. The empty mouth of the service alley. "Why me?" Grace asked, steady because someone had to be. "Because I didn't flinch when they came to my door," Antonio said. "So they came to yours." "Not an answer. It's the only one that's honest until I have a better one." He touched a panel, metal grown somewhere in the bones of the building. "We're moving." "Where?" "A place where glass doesn't invite handwriting." He opened a drawer, withdrew a plain ring of keys, then paused. "You can walk 10 steps behind me if it feels safer." "Why would that feel safer?" "Some people like exits at their backs. I like them where I can see them." She gestured for him to lead, and did not take the hand he didn't offer. They rode the elevator without speaking. The doors opened into a garage that could have been a stage, white lines, cold lights, a car idle with patience. Marco waited with a tablet and a tension that looked like prayer. They knew the camera angles, he said. Dropped the file in a blind spot, stepped back into night, left us the message through a piggybacked maintenance port. Not kids. No, Antonio said. Grace, phone. She lifted the pouch, then hesitated. You going to throw it in the ocean? Not yet. We'll crack it in a Faraday room and see what it says about who thinks they know your Tuesday afternoons. And if it's just a wrong number? Then I'll apologize. He didn't smile. But I don't bet lives on maybes. They drove north into a grid of streets that had learned to wear danger like an old coat. Antonio took corners as if he'd taught the city how to have them. Grace watched the mirrors because he did, measuring the dark SUVs that appeared and disappeared, like thoughts you couldn't shake. Tell me what you didn't tell me downstairs, she said. I told you the truth. Not all of it. He spun that thought once before letting it settle. 3 nights ago, someone ran your name through a watch list that belongs to people who don't use search engines. They tagged your agency profile with a word that means bait, if you grew up the way I did. And you hired me anyway. I hired you because the people who tagged you wanted me to be afraid to. His jaw worked as if the sentence had edges. They wanted me to push you away so they could pull you closer. You're saying the safest place for me is beside the most dangerous man in New York. I'm saying the safest place for you is wherever I can see the angle of the knife. And for better or worse. He glanced at her, then back to the road. I am very good at knives. The car slid into an underground bay beneath a nondescript building with a deli on its face and steel in its spine. A door opened to a corridor lit soft and low, walls lined with the kind of art nobody posts, just keeps. Charcoal studies, unsigned oils that smelled faintly of turpentine and rain. The room they stepped into waited with its hands in its pockets. A long table, a small kitchen, a locker marked with a taped label that read spares. Antonio set the keyring down and motioned to the kettle. Tea? She didn't answer until he'd washed his hands at the sink. It shouldn't have mattered, but it did. Yes, she said. Ginger, if you have it. He did. He sliced the root with the precision of a man who never lets a blade wander. Your mother, he said, not looking up. Does she like tea? She likes whatever I bring her and pretends she likes it more. Grace watched his fingers, how they tucked. Why ask? Because I want to know the shape of the person you're saving. You don't know that I am. I know a ledger when I see one, he said. Time traded for breath, money traded for time. The kettle exhaled. He poured, slid a steaming mug toward her, then wrapped his cut finger in the hem of a dish towel, not noticing the thin red line he'd left on the cutting board until she did. Hold still. The words came out sharper than she meant. He obeyed them like they were the first soft order anyone had given him this week. She pulled alcohol, gauze, a tiny tube of ointment from a drawer that had no right knowing what to hold, and cleaned the cut with hands that had learned on older wounds. You keep medical supplies in a safe house, she said. I keep things I don't want to need and always do. His mouth turned, not a smile, an admission. Thank you. You're welcome. She taped the dressing in place, and for 1 second her fingers rested over the hard pulse in his wrist. She took them back before the second remembered itself. Grace, he said softly, do you know what you're agreeing to by not walking out that door? I haven't agreed to anything except ginger tea and the truth. Good, he said. Then here it is. The family that flagged you are called the Terenzis. They like 2 things, leverage and theater. They plant fire and sell the water. They will pretend to be subtle until they are not. Why me? I'm not leverage. You are if I make you so by my attention. His eyes were tired around the edges. It made him look younger and more dangerous at once. They watch for where I look. I looked at you. Because I was on a ladder in your library. Because you look at things like they're worth saving. He cleared his throat as if the line had come too close to saying something else. Someone in their camp seeded your agency profile with a code that tells their men you're safe to grab if they need a lever. We jammed it. They'll plant it again. So we step ahead. You're not asking my permission, she said. I'm asking your plan. She blinked. That's not how this conversation goes in the stories people tell about you. I don't live in those stories. He glanced down at the bandage like it had embarrassed him into honesty. Tell me where you refuse interference. Tell me where you demand it. My mother is off limits to men with guns and to men in black sweaters who think they know better. He nodded once. Done. My work, both jobs, happens when I schedule it, not when a driver shows up, she added. No shadows at the clinic. Done with conditions, he said. Eyes at the corners, not at the door. You won't see them. You won't feel them. I'll feel them, she said, because women always do. But I'll pretend not to if it keeps her safe. It will, he said, and it sounded less like a promise than an operating principle. And you? What about me? Where do I keep you from breaking? You don't. She took a breath and chose a smaller truth. You can steady the ladder. He let out air he might have been holding since the monitor blinked. I can do that. They spent an hour making the kind of plan that looks thin until it's the only one you have. Marco came and went with silence on his boots. Clinic routes adjusted by minutes that don't look like patterns. A phone replaced with one that had no history but her own name spelled right. A short list of drivers whose first loyalty was to her destination, not to Antonio's patience. When the door closed again, Antonio reached for the chef's knife he'd abandoned. She flinched before she could stop reflex from showing. He set the blade down immediately, palms open. Show me, he said. What? How you hold it so you don't cut yourself when you're distracted by someone breathing behind you. Grace studied his face for mockery, found none, and realized he'd clocked every flicker in her body since the ladder. Without ceremony, she picked up the knife, curled her fingers, tucked her thumb. You make a cage, she said, and you let the tool be the teeth, not your hand. He stood behind her, not touching, a respectful constellation of heat at her back. Like this? Closer on the pinch. The blade listens better when it feels skin. She slid his finger up, feather light. There. He breathed out, and the air between them shifted. You teach well. I don't like blood in kitchens. She put the knife down, aware of her own pulse in a place she could name now. Lower, warmer, impossible to ignore. He stepped away like a man who'd promised himself he would. Marco thinks the Terenzis want a show of chaos, Antonio said, voice back to business. I think they want me to do what I did to every other threat, lock it in a box and throw it in the river. And you won't? She asked. He looked at her like she was a cliff and he was tired of pretending to be the ocean. Not if you tell me not to. Then don't. Not yet. Why? Because chaos tells you less than a patient man, she said. If someone planted that watch list tag, they'll plant again. And when they think you're not swinging, they'll get close enough to smell their own gasoline. He let that land. You talk like someone who's watched a house burn. I watch bills burn. Grace wrapped her hands around her mug. Whole lives go to ash in a mailbox. They returned to the mansion after dusk, when the city wore its bruises under velvet. Security had grown a second skin, black vans with their lights off, earpieces translating silence, a pair of men on the roof who looked like they hated heights and loved lines of sight. Antonio didn't take her through the grand doors. He led her by the service corridor that knew their names now and into the library where it had started. Finish what you came to finish, he said. We leave when you decide, not when a ghost does. Grace climbed the ladder with the kind of composure you have to nail down like furniture in an earthquake. Her brush found the bloom again, coaxed, lifted, mended. The varnish took a new skin without losing its old one. She worked because it was medicine not to. She worked because in a world built on unsaid things, wood told the truth about pressure. Below, Antonio spoke in Italian to a voice she could not hear. No sudden moves. No one touches the perimeter. If they want an audience, they can buy tickets like everyone else. He ended the call and looked up at her the way men look at ceilings for answers. I want to see the file, she said down to him. It's ugly. So's cancer. He nodded. After. Before, she said. Or I'll never know if you're telling me the worst parts. He said something that wasn't quite a curse and wasn't quite a prayer, then went to the hidden panel, slid it back, and brought the folder out like a weapon he refused to aim. He climbed 2 rungs, met her eyes, and handed it up. The top photo was the same one she'd seen, her under winter sky with the envelope. The second was small and mean. A zoomed-in slice of her mother's face through a hospital window, hand lifted toward a nurse like a question. Rage lit her from the inside. Not hot. Clear. "I need to meet whoever took these," she said. "You won't," Antonio answered, gentle in the only way he knew how. "But the man who ordered it will meet my hand." "On my terms," she reminded him. "On your terms," he said. Then, after a beat, "With my hands." She was about to answer when the room did something old buildings rarely do. It shivered. Not a draft. A warning. Marco's voice arrived a half-breath later, ripped from the corridor. "Skylight." Grace had time for one thought. Glass is just frozen sand, before the first pane sighed. Cold air knifed down. Antonio's head snapped up, eyes cutting through angles she hadn't learned how to see. He moved with the kind of speed that looks like choice, not panic. "Down," he said, and the word didn't ask. She flattened a heartbeat before the high, clean scream of tempered glass turned into a rain of glittering teeth. The ladder jerked, her foot slid. Gravity remembered her. Antonio was already there, shoulder under the ladder, palm on the rung, the other hand catching her as she slipped the last step like he'd practiced it in a dream he hated. A second sound cracked the air, smaller than she expected, louder than she could bear. The rug spat wool. A leather chair gasped a bloom of feathers. A line of wood near her shoulder went mute with shock. Not kids, not a warning shot either. A calculation. "Sightline, east roof!" Someone yelled from somewhere she couldn't see. "Hold fire!" Antonio snapped, rolling his body to cover hers before a second shot could find curiosity. He didn't crush. He contained, turning her behind the couch's spine with a precision that didn't jar the bone he'd just saved. Grace. His mouth was at her hairline, calm, terrible. "Don't move." She didn't. She tasted copper and lemon oil and fear that had decided to be useful. Across the room, a second pane surrendered, scattering stars. Men without faces in the windows took the roof like it owed them money. Antonio's hand lifted, flat and low, and that somehow kept them from firing into air that still glittered. "Sniper's not after me," he said in a voice that belonged in another century. "Angle's wrong if I'm the prize." "Then who?" "Anyone who stands where you are," he said, and the way he said it erased every polite euphemism left between them. "Why now?" "Because we said yes," he answered, "and because someone needed me to hear the way you breathe when you think you're about to die." "You always this poetic when glass is falling?" she managed. "Only when I hate the author," he said, and something like a smile ghosted his mouth, savage and gone. "Boss!" Marco barked from the side hall, hunched under the line of the broken skylight. "We've got the green jags circling, 1 rooftop, 3 buildings out, and—" He looked at the floor where the bullet had kissed the rug, and the next words came like a verdict. "That's a mark round, not a warning." "Grace," Antonio said, still covering her with a geometry that refused to be anything but deliberate. "Look at me." She did. Her heart had decided to stop being nice. "The men outside belonged to Terenzi," he said. "But the shot didn't. Different signature. Which means someone else wants credit," she finished, "or someone wants a war that starts with your name." He searched her face for an answer only she could give, and she realized what he was asking had nothing to do with bullets. "Do we run?" he asked. "Or do we stay and make them show their hands?" Grace stared up through the ragged square of night where the skylight had been, at a slice of winter cloud that looked like wiped chalk. Somewhere out there a rifle watched for a flinch. Somewhere in here a man waited for permission to be everything he already was. She inhaled until air felt like a decision. "Stay," she said. "On your terms," he said. "On mine," she answered, and reached for his uninjured hand, like it was the hinge to the next door. A red dot bloomed on the broken cornice, then slid, slow, searching toward the place her head had been a minute before. The room held its breath for the second time that day as the dot stopped, steadied, and moved deliberately to the exact center of Antonio's chest. They left the library beneath plastic-wrapped glass and the taste of a threat that missed. Orders moved like weather, quiet everywhere. A sedan, the color of respect, slid forward. "On my terms," Grace reminded him. "On yours," Antonio said, and meant it. They drove east, the river hammered flat by wind. Antonio's phone lit his jaw, then went dark. "Your mother, clinic or hospital tonight?" "Clinic. Chemo day. It won't be the bus." He didn't look at her. "A clinic car will take her home. If you prefer a bus tomorrow, she'll have it. Tonight, I'm not performing restraint at your expense." "With consent," she said. "With consent," he agreed, and she heard that he'd chosen the word on purpose. The clinic smelled like lemon and paper. A braid-haired nurse waved them to the family room. Yunmi Lee sat under a crocheted blue blanket, the brave tilt of her mouth softening when she saw her daughter. "My girl," she said, and then to Antonio, in careful English, "You must be the latter man." "I'm the man at the bottom of it," he answered, bowing like respect had muscle memory. Yunmi studied him the way women study weather. "Do you play music?" "Piano," he admitted, as if it were indecent. "Too loud for small apartments," she said, smiling. "Good." They rode home with the quiet of people who've paid for silence in other rooms. Grace tucked her mother in, straightened the lamp, closed the door. "That photo," Antonio said in the living room. Grace at 12, gap-toothed, holding a wooden awl carved with GL. "Your grandfather?" "Carpenter, frames. He taught me to hold a tool like it could bite." "Did he carve your initials?" "He said wood already has a name," she said, and his mouth tilted like a man who understood difficult kindness. In the hall, Antonio's phone hummed. He listened, removed the battery, pocketed the pieces. "Relocation. Temporary. 2 places where my sight lines are clean. Not a cage, a corridor." "For me and my mother," she said. "For you and your mother," he replied, and the crack in his voice let light in. They didn't sleep. Morning found them high above the city in a room with glass from knee to sky and a piano waiting like a quiet animal. "Play," Grace said. He did, low, honest, no showing off. A waltz that wasn't, a radio detuned, a boy counting to 3 because one felt like a gunshot. "What is it?" she asked when the melody found its road. "My grandfather's kitchen. Play the part where he forgets the words." He did. When he lifted his hands, the room felt less haunted, more held. "How old when you stopped?" she asked. 17. My father died." The applause moved to rooms with no music. "Is there time now?" "There is if you ask me to make it." "I'm asking." He nodded like a vow and closed the lid gently, the way a man closes a door in a burning house without slamming it. They drew a plan over ginger tea, drivers who were loyal to her destination, routes that looked like chance, protection she wouldn't have to see to feel. He reached for a chef's knife. She flinched on reflex. He set it down, palms open. "Show me how not to cut myself when someone breathes behind me." She taught him the pinch grip, sliding his fingers a whisper. "Let the tool be the teeth. You teach well. I don't like blood in kitchens." By afternoon, he took her down to a vault that hummed like a locked heart. He set a ledger box under a crisp white light. "This is what men want here. Proof I am what they say I am." "You are what you are," she said. No absolution, no indictment. He lifted the dust jacket. She leaned in, a faint orange thread at the hinge, a sharper tang at the corner. "Olympian varnish," she said. "Your conservator's touch." She shifted. "But this corner is colibri, similar chemistry, different bloom. Whoever sealed this did it in 2 hands." "A forgery," he said. "A repair on a forgery. A rush job. Someone with my skill set dressed this box to pass quick inspection. Someone like you. Or someone who taught someone like me," she said, and the sentence hung like a bridge she hadn't crossed in years. Upstairs, Marco arrived with a binder that felt heavier than paper. "Green Jag is a shell for a Thursday philanthropist with bad cologne. The watch list tag on Ms. Lee's agency profile was reseated an hour after we cut it, piggybacked through an old maintenance account. Password, Janus123. I'd like to send a fruit basket labeled, "Please stop." Janus, Grace said, my subcontractor. Lazy with doors. Marco's mouth flattened. Also, the men who circled the clinic didn't circle again. Antonio's shoulders eased a fraction. They went to the hospital, Marco finished. He slid a still of 2 men in 2 clean jackets, hands too empty for family. Asked for a schedule. Whose? Antonio asked, voice like a drawn line. Your mother's, Marco said to Grace. They're late to their own party. We moved her, but they asked. They'll try the door until someone tells them the house is gone. Antonio didn't look at the photo. He looked at Grace. We don't wait. No, she agreed. Then we go first, he said. To Janus, Marco added. He pulled a worn postcard from the binder, a museum exhibition on Renaissance frames, a list of guest restorers. At the bottom, guest restorer, M.J.O. Grace's stomach learned a new floor. Minjay, oh, she whispered, my mother's brother. Silence sealed the room. Her phone buzzed. A new number, not the one that mocked her route. Olympian blooms if you rush it. Colibri lies prettier under bad light. Don't confuse the two, kid. A second text. Tell your mother not to take the north elevator on Thursdays. It sticks, and they like stuck. He's watching, she said. He thinks it's protection, Antonio answered, with the weary fury of a man who'd seen protection done badly. Outside, the city darkened at the edges. The piano sat between beats. Tomorrow we go to the museum, Grace said. Tomorrow, Antonio agreed. For tonight, Marco said, we harden the doors. For tonight. Antonio corrected softly, eyes still on Grace. We don't blink. He reached for the kettle to refill her cup. Steam curled like handwriting. You are here. You are seen. You are not alone. The wall monitor flickered to a new feed. Hospital hallway, north elevator, 3rd floor. 2 clean jacket men looked up into the lens like they'd been invited. One lifted a paper crane, opened it slow, blank inside. On the outside, a single word in red that wasn't ink. Thursday. The screen held on the crane. The elevator doors slid, stuck for a breath, then closed, like the building itself had learned the message by heart. Would Minjay meet them at the museum or at the elevator? And if he came bearing warnings, which price would his help demand? The museum slept under a sheet of rain. Antonio parked behind the service gate, headlights dimmed. You don't have to go in, he said. I do, Grace answered. Some ghosts don't come to doors. You have to meet them inside. They slipped through the west entrance, Marco silent as their shadow. The museum smelled of varnish, wood, and something older, trust that had been stored too long. The exhibition carved light stretched before them, Renaissance frames glowing under soft lamps. Grace's fingers hovered over the air, tracing details only another artisan would notice. You belong here, Antonio murmured. I belong where broken things can still be saved. He stopped, voice low. If I ever become something you have to save, tell me, and I'll leave before you break your hands on me. Her breath caught. You won't. A figure stepped from the dark. Minjay, she whispered. Her uncle smiled faintly. You kept your hands. Good. Antonio stood a step behind her, silent, steady. You sent the message, Grace said. I sent a warning, Minjay replied. They already had your name. I just made the trail noisy enough to confuse them. And the forged box? Antonio asked. I redid it myself. Better my hand than theirs. They wanted a weapon. I gave them a riddle. Grace crossed her arms. Why now? Because the men you work for think they can buy safety by selling you. Janus didn't tag your file by accident. Someone inside is trading names for power. Then give me a name. He hesitated. You'll know him soon enough. He smiles too easily. He smells like cheap cologne. Antonio's jaw flexed. You're talking about the deputy. Minjay nodded. He thinks the ledger in your vault holds the story of your sins. He'll use her to open doors you locked. Grace shook her head. He'll fail. Not if you keep letting him near your heart, her uncle warned softly. Antonio stepped closer to Grace then, close enough that his warmth steadied her, close enough that Minjae's eyes flickered with old protectiveness. What do you want from us? Antonio asked. For her to live, Minjae said simply. For her mother to see spring. And for you to remember that love doesn't erase violence, it only asks you to choose who you aim it at. The words hung like a benediction and a curse. A guard's flashlight flared in the next hall. Minjae turned. Go. They'll check cameras soon. And when a package comes, don't run. Read before you react. He vanished between the columns like smoke returning to the dark. They didn't speak until they were back in the car. The rain turned heavier, stitching the silence together. Grace stared at her reflection in the window. I don't know if he saved me or set me up, she said. Maybe both, Antonio murmured. Family can be efficient like that. He reached for her hand, then stopped, hovering. May I? She nodded. His fingers were warm, rough, deliberate. He thinks I'll break you, Antonio said quietly. Will you? Only if you ask me to. Her laugh was soft, wet, tired. That's not how this works. At dawn, a courier waited by the elevator of Antonio's hidden apartment, hat low, voice shaking. For Ms. Lee, he said, handing her a slate-gray box. Inside lay a small awl, worn, smooth, initials carved in childish uneven letters. GL, her grandfather's tool. Beneath it, a folded label from his old workshop, Lee & Son Fine Restoration. In red ink, one line, a tool remembers the first hand. She pressed her thumb to the handle and felt a faint click. The wooden grip opened like a secret. Inside, a sliver of parchment. North Stare. Don't trust the accountant. Antonio's face hardened. I don't have an accountant. You have one too many, she whispered. They stood over the box in silence. The city beyond the glass was still sleeping, unaware that the ground had shifted again. He looked at her, something raw in his eyes. Truth before power, he said softly. That's the pact. She nodded. Yours and mine. He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Then here's my truth. You make me remember who I was before fear became habit. And mine, she whispered. I still believe some broken things can be fixed. For a long moment they didn't move. Two survivors in a house built from secrets, breathing the same promise. Then the elevator behind them chimed, slow, deliberate. The doors began to part, and a familiar voice floated through the gap, smooth, calm, dangerous. Good evening, Mr. Bianchi, Ms. Lee. I believe you've been expecting me. The elevator doors parted like a mouth about to lie. He stepped in smiling, rain on his shoulders, a tasteful scarf, and, Marco's hated detail, a halo of cheap cologne trying to pretend it was expensive. Mid-40s, handsome in the way of men who make a living out of being underestimated. He held a leather folder tight to his chest like doctrine. Mr. Bianchi, he said. Ms. Lee. His voice carried the glow of donor galas and check presentations. I believe we have a mutual interest in culture. Antonio did not offer a chair. He didn't offer a hand. He angled his body so Grace was at his left, inside his reach. State your name. The smile brightened. Paolo Val. I chair the Terenzi Arts Foundation. He let the last word linger. You've seen our green jag, I think. Marco didn't raise his gun. He didn't have to. The room understood that someone had done the arithmetic already. Grace kept her gaze on the folder, not on the man. The foundation that counterfeits compassion to launder fear. Paolo's eyes warmed, like he appreciated a good sentence even when it cut. You must be the conservator. I've heard your hands can open wood that's been sleeping since dukes were boys. She won't open anything for you, Antonio said. Oh, Paolo answered lightly. She already has. He set the folder on the table with reverence he did not deserve and slid a single photograph across the wood. The image made the room smaller. A Renaissance frame in the carved light exhibition. Laurel leaves chased in gold. corners mitered so clean even machines would weep. A red circle bled over the top rail. "Tomorrow night," Paolo said. "Donor tour. We'd like Ms. Lee to restore a small flaw on this frame for our guests, under the lights, in front of the camera." "Staged," Marco muttered. "Educational," Paolo corrected, unbothered. "She'll open a seam. She'll find a ledger inside, Tisk, the scandal of it, and hand it to a representative of cultural integrity." He tapped the photo where the circle bled. "Me." Antonio didn't look at the picture. He watched Paolo's eyes. "And if I say no?" Paolo's smile didn't move, but something behind it did. "Then odd things happen on Thursdays. Elevators stick, side doors jam. Nurses get confused about which patient has which visitor." Grace felt the room tilt. "Say my mother's name," she said, low, steady. He didn't. It would have been too crass for his curated brand of menace. "We all love our families," he said instead. "That's why we throw such excellent galas." He stood. "Tomorrow at 8, Museum West entrance. Ms. Lee brings her all, such a darling tool, and does one small, beautiful thing. Then we all go home with our reputations intact." "You think reputations can be put back on like coats," Antonio said. "They can," Paolo said brightly, "if someone folds them for you." He inclined his head, breathed his counterfeit cologne into the air, and stepped backward into the elevator, never turning his back, a man who'd taught his spine to smile. The doors closed. The room exhaled in a knife line. Grace looked at the photo. The laurel leaves were exquisite. The gilding hid 1,000 tiny wounds. "He wants me to open the wrong frame," she said. "If the ledger's anywhere, it isn't there." "He doesn't need the real ledger," Marco said. "He needs the footage of you finding one." "So we don't give him the picture," Antonio said. He turned to Grace. "We give him the mirror." She understood before he explained. "A copy of the frame. A seam that looks right but leads nowhere. We let him walk into his own trick." "On your terms," he said. "On yours," she returned, and shook her head. "No, on ours." They planned until the city lifted its first coffee. Marco diagrammed routes and contingencies on the kitchen island. Grace sketched the frame from memory, fingers moving faster than fear. Antonio listened, cut fat from the plan, and refused to accept odds that fell below what he could live with if she bled. "We need a twin," Grace said finally. "Not perfect. Just good enough under museum light to carry his eyes past the lie." "I can get you wood," Marco said. "Not wood," Grace murmured. "History." She dialed a number that wasn't saved in the new phone. It rang once. "You shouldn't call," Min-jae's voice said, "but you should ask." "Can you get me a laurel frame with the right age on the right places?" Grace asked. "I only need 5 minutes under bad light." He didn't pretend to be surprised. "I can give you 4. That's enough?" "And Antonio?" Her uncle added, casual as a dial tone. "What about him?" "Tell him to duck right when the second shot comes." She swallowed. "What second shot?" But the line had already gone empty. They set the stage with a patience that hurt. A donor list screened 3 ways, decoy cars, a second team at the clinic and a third at the hospital with visitor logs pre-cleared under names that would not be mistaken. Grace wore black with sleeves that didn't catch. She tied her hair back like a promise. Antonio dressed down, no tie, open collar, a jacket that moved with him, the kind of quiet that made rooms mistake him for anything but a storm. "Last chance to run," he said, not as a dare, as a kindness. "Last chance to trust me," she answered. He smiled then, a small private thing that no camera could counterfeit. I started. They arrived at the west entrance in rain that made the museum glow. Inside, the exhibition had been cleaned until it squeaked. Donors hovered, fragrant and curious. Paolo Vale appeared as if conjured by applause, warm palms, warmer teeth. "Ms. Lee," he greeted. "Shall we enlighten the generous?" Her hands were steady as she approached the frame. The twin Min-jae had moved like a rumor now hung where it needed to. The seam she'd cut, then filled with a whisper of gesso and breath, would open and close like a blink. She set her kit down. She felt Antonio at her back, a heat that learned where her fear lived and put his body between it and the world. She worked quickly. The donors leaned in, glittering, phones rising, the museum's intellect reduced to gallery gossip. Grace's awl sang against gilding, a sound most people mistake for damage and conservators recognize as prayer. "There," she said lightly, "a 19th century reglue, sometimes the tiniest touch." The seam whispered open. Paolo stepped closer, eyes bright. And inside. "Dust," she said. But her fingers had already found the other thing she needed, the vellum she'd hidden in the cavity Min Jae had carved inside the twin. She unrolled it with the neat drama of a truth. Numbers winked, columns tidy, a ledger. Cameras drank it in. Paolo's face softened into victory. "Careful," she told him as he extended his hand. "The leaf will flake if you breathe too hard." He laughed, thrilled to be warned in public. "Of course." He took the roll with 2 fingers like a man born to archivists. Behind him, Antonio's people shifted the way wolves do when they smell a shot that hasn't been fired yet. It came a breath later, a round that snapped glass without shattering reputation, small caliber, mean. The crowd dropped as one organism taught to perform survival. Antonio moved left on instinct and right because of a memory that wasn't his. Tell him to duck right when the second shot comes. The second shot cracked the air where his ribs had been. 2 o'clock, Marco barked into a cuff. "Upper mezzanine." "Hold," Antonio snapped back. "Too many civilians." Paolo didn't flinch. He'd rehearsed this theater. He smiled at the donors creeping to their knees. All part of modern museum life. He joked, voice soothing, body turning toward the exit where 2 men in dark coats waited to escort him, and the ledger, into a story he'd already written. Grace looked at Antonio. He was breathing, unharmed, furious in a clean, controlled way that made her love him like an ache. "Now," she said. They moved. Marco's team created a corridor with their bodies, a street that existed only for 3 breaths. Grace walked Paolo through it like a docent leading a tour, speaking low, friendly, fake. "You'll want to authenticate," she said. "My lab is down this hall. It's safer from cameras there." "Splendid," Paolo praised. Backstage, behind a black curtain that hid service doors and the ugly truth of art, Grace counted steps, counted heartbeats, counted the number of ways this could fail. At the door marked conservation, she palmed the keypad. It clicked to a room that smelled like alcohol and secrets. Stainless tables waited under white light. Mirrors hid cameras. The twin frame stood on a cradle like a patient. Antonio slipped in behind them with one of his men. The door locked. The thunder of the crowd softened to a rumor. "Here," Grace said, laying the vellum on a glass table. "Spritz. Light. We'll see the telltales." Paolo bent because vanity makes even careful men clumsy. She misted the paper. Under light, the columns bloomed microtext, a watermark that wasn't a watermark, a code. "What is—" he began. "It's a mirror," Antonio said. He was close enough now that Paolo had to feel the change in the room. "Hold your prize to the light, Mr. Vale." Paolo lifted the strip. The glass table glowed white. The vellum woke. Hidden text crawled up like a confession punched into paper. Property of the Terenzi Arts Foundation, financial operations. Beneath it, in a neat line, a string of dates and transfers. A ledger, yes, but not Antonio's. Theirs. Stamped with the Foundation's own embedded security markers, visible only when the sheet met a polarized spectrum. Paolo went very still. "No," he whispered, the first honest word he'd said. "Oh, yes," Marco said cheerfully, appearing in the mirror behind him. Smile for the camera. In the reflection, behind the conservation glass, donors were gathering, whispering, filming again. Somewhere, a guard's radio went high with panic. Somewhere else, a siren chose a street. "Call your men off the hospital," Grace said, the softness of her voice a razor. "Now!" Paolo's eyes flicked to the door, then to Antonio, then, like all men who underestimate hands that hold awls, to Grace. "You think you've won. I think you were careless," she said, "and I think paper hates men like you." He coughed a laugh and tried for dignity. You won't publish that. It brings too many buildings down. Antonio stepped close enough that the cologne finally had to retreat. I don't need to publish it tonight. I just need you to know I have it. You will go to the front of the museum and talk about the generosity of strangers. You will leave. You will tell your boss the ledger is a myth, and you will not touch the north elevator or anything that loves Grace Lee. And if I don't? Antonio's smile had no temperature. Then tomorrow morning every donor in this city wakes to a neat little package explaining how their name got so clean. Paolo studied him, saw the man who meant it, and did not pretend to be braver than he was. His chin dipped once. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," he murmured, and walked out of the room as if it were his idea. He was 3 steps down the service hall when the world reminded them it wasn't done. A third shot, closer. A shout. The crack of a door abused. Grace felt Antonio's body turn before his mind did and moved with him. They rounded a corner into a narrow corridor that smelled like damp cardboard and old paint. 2 men had Marco pinned in a geometry that always ends with a hospital. Antonio drove into the first shoulder with controlled violence. The second man pivoted, gun up, and Grace did what she had learned from Wood. She found the seam. She slammed the base of the awl into the man's wrist, not the bone. Never the bone, the tendon, and his hand went bright with pain, his fingers opening like a door. The gun fell. Antonio's fist found the man's breath. The hallway remembered how to be quiet. Marco sat up, grinning like a man who hated smiling. "You always bring restoration tools to a gunfight?" "Only when men try to cut corners," she panted. Antonio looked at her like the room had gone out of focus around the fact of her. "Are you hurt?" "No." He put his hand to her jaw anyway, thumb skimming the soft place beneath her ear. A touch so careful it made her knees consider giving. "Good," he said, voice frayed, reverent. "I told you," she said, trying for lightness and failing. "I'm good with seams." "Show me again," he whispered, and he kissed her. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't a door kicked in. It was a vow made with mouths and breath. He didn't take. He didn't test. He asked and she answered, and for a handful of seconds the city shut up and let them live. They broke on the sound of feet and radios. They ran because survivors run, down a flight of stairs that pretended not to know their names. The service exit spat them into rain and blue light. Sirens were choosing lanes. Donors were choosing narratives. Paolo Val, the man who smelled like bad choices, slipped into a jag that blended with all the other lies he'd tell himself to sleep. They didn't chase. They didn't need to. The ledger would do the chasing now. In the car, Antonio's hands shook once, twice, then steadied. Grace took one into both of hers, folding his palm like a prayer she didn't deserve and was saying anyway. He didn't pull away. "Tell me you're real," he said, startling himself with the nakedness of it. "I'm here," she said, "and I'm not leaving." He laughed, a ragged sound, and kissed the top of her hand like a man teaching himself a gentler language. They drove in the shadow lanes, past museums learning how to lock their doors, past streets that would forget this night by morning. Marco's voice moved ahead of them, behind them, around them. Curses, updates, the delighted threat of a man who enjoys a clean win almost as much as a messy fight. When they reached the private elevator, Grace's body remembered exhaustion. The doors closed and the world shrank to stainless steel and breath. She leaned her forehead to Antonio's chest and listened to his heart, fast, human, not invincible. He folded her in like a secret he would not spend. The doors opened onto the apartment, light low, city dark beyond the glass, the awl box still on the table like a challenge. She started toward it and stopped, because someone was already there. He stood in the window's reflection first, tall, angular, a coat that knew rain, hands empty to keep alarms asleep. When he turned, the light caught the careful scar along one knuckle, the solvent tender cuticles, the eyes that rarely moved and saw everything anyway. "Uncle," Grace said. "Minje," Antonio acknowledged, not surprised, not welcoming, exactly unhating. Her uncle looked at the frame of them, his niece, and the man who loved her like an admission, and something older than the city crossed his face. "I taught you to see straight lines," he said softly to Grace. "Why won't you see him?" She felt the words before she understood them. "Who?" Minjay didn't look at Antonio. He looked past him, toward the door, toward the elevator, toward something that had been coming since the first folder found the first doorstep. His voice was almost a whisper. The one who smiles in every room and never pays for the smile. The accountant. A beat, and then from the hall, the soft chime of the elevator again. Polite, practiced. Minjay's eyes flicked once to Antonio's, and for the first time tonight they agreed without saying it. "North stair," he said. The elevator doors began to slide. A shadow filled the gap, and the perfume in the air was not cologne at all. It smelled like fresh paper and ink. The elevator chimed like a polite blade. Ink bloomed in the air. Fresh paper, warm toner, the sterile sweetness of things that pretend to be official. Grace's fingers found Antonio's without looking. His grip was a question and a promise at once. Minjay stood a half step forward, body angled, eyes on the seam of the doors where secrets split. The panels parted. He wore an accountant's uniform that didn't know it was a costume. Slate suit, narrow tie, an ID badge clipped like virtue. No cologne, just that new document smell, the scent of signatures and lies. Mid-30s, smooth jaw, the kind of harmless hands that file other people's years. His smile was calibrated for banks and back rooms. "Mr. Bianchi," he said mildly. "Ms. Lee." His gaze grazed Minjay without catching. "We should discuss fiscal hygiene." Marco had a gun in his hand between one breath and the next. The accountant didn't blink. He held up empty palms. A folder lay tucked under one elbow the way a priest tucks a book. "Names," Antonio said. The smile lifted a millimeter. "Pick one. I sign a dozen." "You're last," Minjay said. The accountant's eyes ticked, approving the precision. "Ferraro. Luca Ferraro." He stepped inside, letting the doors close on the hall's good sense. "You've met my receipts." Grace saw it then. The confidence of a man who believed paper could build a wall around bullets. Her heartbeat drew a line under the moment. "You were at the museum," she said. "In the mezzanine. 2 o'clock. I'm everywhere someone thinks they know what money is for," Luca said calmly. "Tonight it was art. Tomorrow it's healthcare. Thursdays, philanthropy." He tilted his head, curious. "It's a shame about your mother's hospital. The elevator's misbehaving, the schedule's misprinted. I do dislike waste." Antonio's face didn't change, but the room felt the temperature drop. "You touched her life," he said. "I touched a lever," Luca corrected gently. "Your life is made of them. You have a sentimental weakness for levers with names." Minjay's voice cut in, dry as a bone. "Say what you're here to sell." "Not selling," Luca said. "Auditing. Your ledger, mister." "Bianchi, the myth you hide in boxes and music, has become less valuable than hers." He nodded at Grace, as if granting her a line on a balance sheet. "The market's moved. Love stories command higher prices than crime." "Then you came to the wrong apartment," Marco said. "We don't trade that." "Everyone trades something," Luca replied, still mild. "I offer a reconciliation. You present Ms. Lee tomorrow at the donor tour. She opens the frame I've prepared, she produces the ledger I've designed, and in exchange every red circle around her life goes hollow. The hospital loses interest in Thursdays. The clinic's list cleans itself. Janus," his mouth curved, "changes its password." "Janus," Grace repeated, heat crawling her chest. "You were the maintenance account." "I am the maintenance," he said, almost tender. "Every empire needs a janitor." Antonio stepped closer. "You threatened my family to pull her into your numbers." "I applied pressure to ascertain liquidity," Luca said, as if explaining a recipe. "You have a reputation for responding to violence with theater. I prefer certainty. I wanted to see whether Ms. Lee would stand where she stands now." "And what do you see?" Grace asked. "That he loves you in a way that confuses him," Luca said. "No triumph in it, just accounting. Men like him become inefficient when they love." He looked back to Antonio. "You'll want to maim me for saying that." But you should thank me. Inefficiency keeps kings alive. Tell me what you want, Antonio said, voice like a held door. In a sentence I can cut. A quiet transfer of power dressed as art, Luca said. You let my foundation perform virtue. Your enemies applaud. Your city sleeps. You and Ms. Lee get to practice domesticity with occasional sirens. I get to remove Paolo Vale and inherit his donor lists with my hands clean. Paolo, Marco said, catching the past tense. He's yours already. He always was, Luca answered. Bad cologne, good compliance. His eyes returned to Grace. I regret the crane, crude tool, but you learned from it. You sent the crane? She asked, shock swallowing anger and then spitting it back, leaner. I commissioned the symbol and outsourced the hand, he said. Your uncle's handwriting. My paper. His gaze flicked to Minjai. He's very good at not sleeping. Minjai did not move, but something about his stillness sharpened. You wanted her alive enough to warn. Why? Because dead women are inefficient, Luca said simply. They stop moving money. Silence. Then Antonio's smile. Small, bright as a crack in marble. You made one mistake, accountant. Only one? Luca asked, amused. You came to my home with a script that assumes I'll accept your math. Luca opened his folder. A single glossy photo. Grace's apartment door from months ago. A turned, familiar knob. Your math began before me. She stared. The angle was wrong for a street camera. The light was too intimate. Yunmi's coat hung on the hook in the hallway like a witness. Where did you get that? She whispered. The North Stair, he said quietly. Everything important in this city goes through a North Stair. You know this. You name your chapters after it. He arched a brow at Antonio. You taught her to climb. I taught her to count steps. Antonio's hand tightened around hers. Enough. Luca nodded, as if a meeting had reached agenda item 4. Here are the numbers. You can end this tonight by agreeing. Or, he glanced at his watch, you can play hero while men who obey me try to be creative at a hospital where nurses do not make enough to fail your mother safely. Marco, Antonio said. Already on it. Marco replied, phone to ear, voice low and vicious. 2 teams en route. 3rd team on the North Stair. No, the other North Stair. Yes, the one we built and never use. Luca's smile stayed where it was, but his eyes shifted. First sign he was collecting new information. You have a second. I have 100, Antonio said. But tonight I only need 1. Grace's. Luca studied her, not leering, measuring. If I asked you to open a frame tomorrow, would you? If I opened anything for you, she said, you wouldn't like what crawled out. True things crawl, he murmured. You understand that. You clean them and call it restoration. She took a step forward. Antonio with her, not blocking, accompanying. You want a ledger. Her palm lay flat on the table beside the all box. Here's mine. You leave my mother out of your math. You stop touching the clinic. You stop renting elevators. You fix what you broke at Janus, and you vanish your deputy before dawn. In return, she nodded at the museum photo he hadn't shown, but everyone could see. I take your stage and turn your story into yours. You'll walk out smiling, and you will know that I own your smile. Antonio turned his head a millimeter toward her, enough for her to feel his breath. A question, an astonished, adoring question. Are these your terms? Yes, she breathed, answering words and man at once. On ours. Luca watched them with the clinical interest of a surgeon counting heartbeats. You think you can humiliate me in public and keep breathing? That's inefficient too. I think you confuse humiliation with carbon, she said. One burns, one lets me live. Minjay's phone buzzed once, a sound like a nail tapped into quiet. He didn't lift it. He glanced at Luca instead. At what time does your second shot arrive? Luca's smile returned to polite. 2 minutes ago. The wall monitor blinked. Hospital feed, 3rd floor, north elevator. A man in a utility jacket adjusted a panel. Another set a cone in the hall like a warning and a welcome. A nurse pretended to sort papers while her thumb hovered above a call button. Marco swore in a language that cut faster than bullets. "We're 10 out." "We're 5. Antonio corrected, already moving, already all motion and restraint. He looked at Grace. "Come." Luca shifted to block the door, not with muscle, but with the patience of an idea. "If you leave," he said softly, "you walk into my air. If you stay, you hold yours." Antonio didn't even slow. "You don't have air," he said. "You have numbers. I drown men in numbers for breakfast." Marco shouldered the door. Minjay slid past Luca like water around a rock, already in the hall, already a shadow moving toward stairs because elevators lie. Grace felt the decision rise through her body like heat. Run with Antonio. Trust her uncle to get there first. Choose the door that would be open when her mother needed one. "Go," Antonio said, reading the storm on her face. "I'll take the south corridor. You take the north." "I'm not splitting from you," she said. "Then come break my habits," he answered, and the corner of his mouth lifted like a pact. They ran. The private stairwell swallowed their breath. Antonio's hand steadied her on the turn but never dragged. Somewhere above, the city was a throat full of sirens. Somewhere below, Luca Ferraro adjusted his tie and started dialing a number men answer when they want to live through the night. They burst into the garage. The driver, older, shoulders square from a life of saying no, already had the car open and regret in his eyes for what he couldn't stop. Antonio slid behind the wheel himself. Grace strapped in without looking. The engine woke like a low oath, and they shot into lanes that didn't exist until he made them. "Talk to me!" Antonio barked into the mic. "Marco?" "On your 6, Marco replied, tires singing somewhere behind. "Minjay's ahead. He'll hit the east side." "Hospital?" Antonio asked. "Third floor is expecting a power test," Marco said. "Thanks to our guest. We ghost right past the alarm. We meet at North Stair," Grace said, and didn't realize she'd been shouting until her throat burned. "Copy," 2 voices answered, Marco's and Minjay's. The city blurred. Wet punctuation. Red lights turned green by necessity. Antonio drove like he was making the road a promise. Grace stared through rain and glass at the building that held her mother and too many rules. They hit the curb hard enough to wake the security guard's morals. Antonio kissed a badge across the dash that hadn't been printed. The guard looked at his face and made the correct decision. He waved them through. Inside, elevators hummed polite deceit. Grace didn't look at them. She and Antonio took the service door at a run, the stairwell sucking sound into its concrete ribs. The smell changed. Paint, bleach, fear. Halfway up, voices ghosted down, men trying to sound like maintenance, women deciding whether to pretend they believed them. At the landing, Antonio slowed, not from doubt, from discipline. He pressed Grace's back lightly to the wall with his forearm, a containment, not a cage. He looked down at her like their lives were a hinge that had to click. "Stay behind me," he said. "Stand with you," she corrected. His mouth softened in a way that shattered her. "Stand with me," he agreed. They turned the corner into the corridor of Thursdays. The north elevator sat open like a mouth caught mid-lie. 2 cones flanked it. Caution theater. At the nurse's station, a braid-haired woman floated her thumb above a button and found Grace's eyes with a relief so sharp it hurt. 2 men in utility jackets looked up. Not surprised. Irritated. The kind of irritation men wear when their timetable gets audited. Antonio's voice didn't rise. "That's far enough." One man smiled, acknowledging the rules and choosing to breach them anyway. The other reached inside his jacket for a tool that wasn't for wires. Grace's awl was already in her palm. She stepped, 1, 2, counting seams, choosing tendons, not bones. The nearest man's wrist met the base of the handle with a jolt that made his fingers mislay the tool. Behind him, the second man looked at Antonio and learned the definition of physics with a wall and a shoulder. He folded. The nurse finally pressed the call. Doors that mattered opened the right way. "Room?" Antonio asked the nurse. 314, she said. "But she isn't there. They moved her for the test." I stalled. Where?" Grace demanded. North Stair, the nurse answered. They said she needed the North Stair. Grace ran. Antonio ran with her, and the world stretched into that thin white strand where everything you are gets tested in a single breath. The door to the stair was propped with a wedge that had been kicked, not placed. Cold air poured up like a different city lived below. Footsteps echoed. A shuffle, a murmur, the particular sound of a gurney that doesn't want to be a boat. "Mom," Grace called, voice breaking on the last letter. "Gracie," came faintly, bewildered and fierce. They hit the landing in a tangle, Hyun-mi in a hospital gown and a knit cap, a porter who didn't know whose orders were real, a man at the bottom of the next flight deciding whether to turn and play brave. Antonio didn't give him the option. He took the steps in two, grabbed the rail with his left hand, and pinned the man with his right against the cold metal so neatly it looked like choreography. "It's okay," Grace told her mother, leaning into her, breathless, shaking. "It's okay, I've got you." Hyun-mi's hands, small, stubborn, cupped Grace's face. "Too loud," she scolded, "because that is how some mothers survive fear." Then she looked over Grace's shoulder at Antonio, saw the violence sitting very still in him, and nodded once like a queen recognizing a soldier worth keeping alive. Sirens arrived in the stairwell's bones. Marco's curse came up the shaft like a hymn. Men in real maintenance jackets appeared with real IDs and the look of people who had been told the truth with time to prepare. The cone was kicked aside. The elevator doors at the bottom side closed on a plan that had failed and would be reprinted with prettier fonts. And Luca Ferraro? He stepped out of the shadows on the next landing up, immaculate, unruffled, the hint of toner still touching his air. "You move too fast," he observed to no one and everyone. "Impatience is expensive." Antonio didn't let go of the man he had pinned. "You came to see your numbers hit the floor," he said. "I came to complete an audit," Luca replied, and, God help them, there was sadness in it, as if some column hadn't added the way he liked. Grace straightened. Her mother's fingers found her wrist and squeezed permission into her skin. She descended 2 steps until she stood 1 level below Luca, exactly where his angles would force him to look down to speak, not across. "You're going to walk away," she said. "Now. You'll fix Janus by morning. You'll send flowers to the nurse's station without a card. You'll tell Paolo Vale to retire to a country without museums, and you will never smell my life again. You've taken my ledgers," he said softly. "All I have left is math." "Then learn a better equation," she answered. "One where the remainder is mercy." He searched her face for something he could file. He didn't find it. He found Antonio's hand on her shoulder, and Minjae's shadow on the stairs, and Marco's grin like a blade, and the nurse's bravery dressed as exhaustion, and Hyun-mi's fragile, furious dignity. He found the story he couldn't control. "You'll regret letting me live," Luca said, not as a threat, an analysis, a footnote he could not ignore. Antonio's voice was quiet enough to teach a lesson. "I'm learning to prefer the kind of regret that keeps people breathing." Luca considered that. He nodded once, as a man might at the end of a clean meeting. Then he did what predators do when the herd turns and stares. He stepped back into the dark and took his scent of paper with him, down and away, into the part of the city that forgets names but remembers hands. The stairwell exhaled. The hospital remembered itself. Hyun-mi tugged Grace's sleeve. "I hate stairs," she muttered. "They make old knees loud." Grace laughed and cried at once, forehead on her mother's shoulder. Antonio eased the pinned man to the floor for actual law to gather. He looked at Grace and, in front of everyone, nurses, men, ghosts, he folded a palm around the back of her head and pressed his lips to her hair. "You did that," he whispered. "Not me." "We did it," she corrected. "On ours." He smiled into her hair. "On ours." They put Hyun-mi back where she belonged, in a room that smelled like bleach and kindness. The nurse brought the blue blanket that had learned their story. Marco stationed 2 men at the door and dared anyone to explain policy to him. Minjae stood by the window with his hands in his pockets like a boy who had finally been allowed to come inside. Grace washed her face in the tiny sink. When she looked up, Antonio's eyes were in the mirror, dark, steady, not asking exactly, but letting every answer be possible. "Say the thing," she told him. "The thing," he repeated, mouth tipping. "The one you don't say because men like you survive by not saying anything true." He stepped into the frame beside her, reflection touching reflection, the two of them a diptych that made more sense together. He didn't touch her face, not yet. He touched the mirror between them, and then her shoulder, and then the space just under her throat, like he could feel her pulse with his eyes. "I will never make a decision about your life without you," he said. "I will not turn love into possession. I will learn patience like it's a language and speak it even when I'm bleeding. I will keep your mother safe because she's yours and because she is herself. And I will be the man you already think I am before I've earned it." Her chest hurt. "And when you fail?" "I will say so," he answered. "Then I will fix it, or I will step aside and let you fix me." She turned, pressed her forehead to his, and for a moment that had nothing to do with chalk lines or signatures or secrets, the world became two people learning how to be gentle with the same bruise. "Grace," Hyun-mi called from the bed, voice drowsy and bossy. "Tell your ladder man to sit. He looks like a pine tree trying to be a person." Antonio blinked, surprised into a laugh. He sat. He took Hyun-mi's hand with the respect of a vow. She squeezed his fingers and fell asleep like she trusted the furniture had finally decided to be safe. Hours later, minutes maybe, the sky outside the window began to pale like a bruise deciding to heal. Marco's phone pinged. He skimmed, grinned. Jana's password changed, elevator serviced, flowers at the desk with no card, and Vale booked a one-way to no museums. He looked at Antonio. "Our accountant likes efficiency after all." "Good," Antonio said, and didn't look away from Grace. Min-jae cleared his throat. "I have something you'll want." From his coat he withdrew a small vellum envelope, the kind that used to hold recipe cards and now held outcomes. He offered it to Grace. She opened it and found not a ledger, not a threat, but a photograph. A girl standing in sawdust with a gap-toothed smile, holding an awl like a candle. "Where did you—" "The back of your grandfather's shop," he said, "before things burned. I kept it because I am sentimental, not because I am efficient." She slipped the photo into her jacket over her heart. "Thank you," she said, and meant, "I forgive you enough to keep trying." He nodded once like a man who accepted partial absolution as an expensive gift. The morning nurse replaced the night in the doorway. Paperwork waited like a patient nobody liked. Life, rude and relentless, reassembled itself around them. Antonio stood. The city outside was beginning to tick. He reached into his pocket and drew out something small and old, gold without shine. A ring with a thin band, worn where a man's thumb had rubbed it in prayer. "My grandfather's," he said, almost shy. He cooked with it on. He played piano with it off. He looked at Grace and his voice, this man's voice, wavered. "I don't have a speech, just math I can live with. You, me, a house that doesn't pretend to be a fort, a piano that doesn't gather dust, a mother who complains about the noise. Thursdays that mean groceries." She stared at the ring and then at him and then at her mother sleeping with that stubborn little frown that meant she'd dreamed in Korean. Tears rose, steady and clean. She nodded because her mouth decided crying would be more useful than words. "Yes," she said, and the word felt like a new hinge clicking where an old one had screamed. "On ours." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit like something that had been waiting without knowing where to go. Min-jae coughed into his fist. Marco pretended to check a text and failed to hide the grin. The nurse smiled, the kind of smile you bring to work in a hospital because sometimes you get to see something worth staying for. Hyun-mi opened one eye. "Is that ring dishwasher safe?" she asked, completely awake and utterly herself. Grace laughed so hard she hiccuped. "No dishwashers in our new house," she said. "Only men who learned piano." Antonio bowed his head like Grace before a meal. "I'll wash," he promised. "I'll play. I'll wait." The day brightened. The hospital smelled like coffee and resolve. Somewhere in the city, A man who loved numbers made a new column called Mercy and didn't balance it. A foundation rewrote its mission statement. A museum added a clause about living conservators refusing to perform for men with cameras. An elevator stopped pretending. And in a small room with a blue blanket and a window that finally remembered how to be kind, a woman with a scar across her smile and a man with music in his hands sat on either side of a bed and learned the simplest, hardest arithmetic there is. One life, then another, then a shared one. The north stair waited outside the door, harmless now, just concrete and metal and steps. Grace looked at it and felt nothing but gratitude. Not because it had almost taken everything, but because it had shown her where the exits were and how to choose the one that didn't cost her her own name. She kissed her mother's forehead. She kissed Antonio's knuckles. She looked out at the morning and let herself believe that the dangerous path really had led here. This quiet, this ring, this stubborn, ordinary miracle. It was not the end. It was the beginning that let every ending after it be a choice. "Come home," Antonio said, soft enough that only love could hear it. "I am," she answered, and for once the city did not argue. If you enjoy stories like this, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. That's how I'll know you truly liked it. Even if you're watching on your TV, grab a second to join this family of fans who love emotional and heartfelt stories. Your support means everything, and it helps us bring you even more tales like this one.